The Portsmouth Athenaeum houses some incredibly unique artifacts, one of which is an axe with a broken handle and a macabre history. The year was 1868 when John Hontvent and his wife Maren moved to Smutty Nose Island, a part of the Isle of Shoals. The Isle of Shoals is a small grouping of islands off Portsmouth, New Hampshire, with some islands extending into the waters of Maine. The couple lived in a red house surrounded by thickets of bayberry and wild roses. John, a fisherman by trade, owned a schooner and spent long hours offshore. But Maren was not alone on the island. She had her small dog, Ringe, a loyal companion who spent much of his time running freely on the near treeless terrain of the island. In May 1871, Maren's sister Karen arrived from Norway to stay with them. They also met a man named Louis, a dark, muscular Prussian man. Louis fished near the Isles alone, and soon became fast friends with the family. After about a year, John's fishing business was really taking off. He not only had a schooner, but he also had implemented a multi-hook technique for catching much more fish than most others in the area were at the time. Needing an extra pair of hands, John decides to hire Louis to help him fish. They also offer Louis a place in their home to stay, and for a time all is well in the household. Then in October of 1872, John's brother Matthew, along with Maren's brother Ivan and his wife Annette, came to live with them as well. For 5 weeks the group lived together, but the house proved to be full, so it was decided that Louis should leave. He booked passage on the schooner Addison Gilbert and left Smutty Nose in November. However, his luck would take a turn for the worst, and the ship wrecked before arriving at its destination. Louis, with his belongings lost, was forced to work on the Portsmouth pier for little pay and was scarcely able to cover his rent. By March of 1873, Louis was destitute. Under clear sunny skies, John, his brother Matthew, and Ivan set sail on March 5, 1873. The plan was to travel to Portsmouth to sell their catch and purchase bait that would arrive on the early train from Boston once the trawl lines were in. They met a neighbor at sea and asked him to stop at Smutty Nose to tell the women that the winds had changed and that they should sail straight to the mainland, so that means they would be arriving home later that evening. It was late in the afternoon when the neighbor met with the women to deliver the message. The three decided to keep dinner warm until the men returned because they had already prepared it. When the men got to Portsmouth, they saw a familiar face. Louis was working on the docks at the time and assisted the men in tying off the ship. He inquired about their catch while making casual conversation. He also inquired if the men intended to return that evening to Smutty Nose. John had no reason to suspect his friend of anything, even though he found the question a little curious. John explained that if the bait arrived on time, they would travel home. However, if it arrived late, they would remain in port to bait the trawl lines and travel home in the morning. Baiting the lines was an all-night job, so John asked if Louis would be willing to help with the task. Louis agreed, but said he needed to check on something in town first and would return as soon as he had finished. Louis never returned to the docks that night. It was 7:30 p.m. that evening when Louis was last seen in Portsmouth. He knew John had a very profitable business and had also heard it mentioned that John was saving money to buy a new ship, possibly keeping the cash in his home. He also discovered that the bait had not made it on the early train. As a result, the men would spend the night baiting the lines and not return home until the following morning. Louis devised a bizarre plan to break into the Hontvents' house. It was a calm, dark night on the Piscataqua riverbanks where Wagner stole a dory. He quickly rowed into the harbor and out to sea. Now it's a 12-mile row out to the Isles of Shoals. However, a skilled oarman like Louis could make it. Meanwhile, at the Hontvents' home, the women had decided not to wait up any longer, and they got ready to turn in for the night. Due to it being a cold night, Karen sat up to sleep in the kitchen where it would be warmer than staying in the upstairs bedrooms, and Maren and Annette would sleep in the adjoining bedroom. So as the men are baiting the lines and the women are preparing for bed, Louis rowed the dory closer to the snow-covered island. He rowed to the other side of the island and disembarked on the rocky shore, not in the cove where John's ship, the Clarabella, normally moored. After the window light went out, he spent quite some time observing the cottage. Once he was sure the women were asleep, he made his way to the door of the house. He quietly tried the door and found it was not locked. Lewis crept inside and shut the door behind him. He then secured the bedroom door where Maren and Annette were sleeping by jamming a small piece of driftwood into the latch. Now up to this point, Lewis had planned to accomplish his raid undetected. He didn't know that Karen would be sleeping in the kitchen. And at some point, Ringe was alerted to the stranger's presence and started barking wildly, alerting Karen, who sleepily asks, "John, is that you?" Maren, hearing the commotion, sits up in bed and calls to her sister, "Karen, is everything all right?" Karen, seeing a silhouetted figure in the moonlight coming through the window, replies, "It's just John. He scared me." But as she's replying, Lewis is now startled and starting to panic. Not knowing what to do, he grabs a kitchen chair and smashes it down onto Karen. She screams as Wagner continues brutally striking her. Maren jumps out of bed. Karen, what's wrong?" She starts tugging at the door handle, but it's jammed. Karen, bleeding, is struggling to get to her feet as she's thrown into the bedroom door. This frees the latch, and Maren is finally able to open the door, just in time to see Lewis swinging the chair for another blow, this time striking both women. Maren is somehow able to drag Karen into the room and shut the door, quickly barricading it. Lewis is trying desperately to get in the room, pounding at the door. Everyone is yelling, Ringe is barking frantically. Annette is frozen in fear. All she can do is watch terrified. Maren calls to Annette, "Run! Hide!" as she bolts the door. A nearly incoherent Annette climbs out of the bedroom window, barefoot onto the snow-covered ground. But it was too late. Wagner had given up on the door and had made his way outside of the house. He sees Annette climb out the window and went straight for the girl. Maren screamed, "Run!" just as the identity of the attacker became clear to Annette. "Lewis? Lewis?" she said in disbelief. This man, whom they so readily took into their home, their friend, was trying to kill them. She raised her hands to him as he grabbed the axe from the woodpile next to him. In one motion, he raised the axe and brought it down on the girl's head. The blow shattered her skull, killing her. Her lifeless body shuddered as it fell, as Lewis continued driving the steel blade into her over and over. Maren watched the gruesome sight through the window, so close she could have reached out and touched his arm. Seeing Annette could no longer be helped, she quickly turned her attention to saving herself and her sister. She ran over to the bed where Karen was still dazed from being struck with the chair. Karen, we must run!" But Karen was listless and only replied, "No, too tired." Wagner at this point had finished his butchery of Annette and was heading back to the bedroom door with his axe. Maren's sense of self-preservation told her that they both were doomed if they stayed together, so she grabbed a heavy skirt, slung it around herself, snatched up Ringe, and jumped out the window. The snow on the ground immediately beneath her was blood-soaked. She saw what now remained of Annette crumpled on the ground on the snow as she ran. The icy undergrowth tore her bare feet, but she paid it no mind. This was life or death. She ran to the cove in hopes of finding Wagner's boat to escape the island, but it wasn't there. Panic set in as her mind races to think of where to hide. If she can't get off the island, she must hide. She knew of an abandoned building not far, but quickly concluded that Wagner would surely search there. So she decided instead to run to the far side of the island, where he would be less likely to look for her. But to get there, she would have to circumvent the house. She stuck as close as she could to the shore, but she could hear the screams of Karen echoing in the distance. Karen tried to escape through the window as Wagner entered the room. Wagner swung the axe wildly at her fragile frame as she tried to escape out the window, smashing it on the windowsill, breaking the handle. At which point Wagner wrapped a handkerchief around her neck and pulled hard until he was sure the job was done. Lewis then spent the rest of the early morning hours searching for Maren. He looked all over the island in a frantic attempt to find her. This is where it gets even more bizarre. As he realizes the sun will be coming up soon, and the men will be on their way back, he knows he only has a short period of time to get off the island. But he hasn't even found what he came for yet, the money! So he runs back to the house, drags Annette's body into the kitchen, and lays her on the floor. Then he makes tea and eats some food. with the bodies of the two girls just laying there. He eats, ransacks the house, and is only able to find $15, runs to the stolen dory, and flees. At around 8 in the morning, Marin finally dares venture out from her hiding spot to seek help. Her feet are frozen, but she manages to stumble her way across a breakwater to the neighboring island of Appledore. She spots some children playing outside their house and calls to them for help. The children's father, George, then rode nearly a quarter mile to Marin's rescue. He brings her back to his home while his wife cares for her, while he gathers a group of men armed with guns to head to Smutty Nose. They get to Smutty Nose to start to search for Lewis, and when they arrive at the house, they find the brutal scene just as Marin described. But since there was no sign of Wagner, the group headed back to Appledore. Around that time, John's ship, the Clarabella, was spotted and the men signaled it. Matthew and Ivan, seeing the signal, took a small boat from the Clarabella to Appledore, while John continued on his way to moor at Smutty Nose. As Matthew and Ivan land on Appledore, they are told of some trouble on Smutty Nose and run into George's house where Marin is being cared for. As she's explaining what happened to the two men, Ivan pleads, "Aneth, where is Aneth?" To which Marin replies, sobbing, "Aneth is at home." Ivan and Matthew then race to the boat and row feverishly towards Smutty Nose. The two arrive at Smutty Nose at the same time as John, and the three run to the house. Ivan rushes in the front door and immediately sees Aneth lying lifeless on the floor. He runs back out of the house and completely breaks down. After John and Matthew take a look around the house, they decide to head back to Appledore and then sail to Portsmouth to report the situation to the authorities. The police in Portsmouth telegraph a description of Wagner to the coastal states, and the newspapers report the incident that evening and publish it in full detail. Two men who knew Wagner state that they had seen him at about 6 o'clock that morning in Newcastle. Later, the stolen dory was also found in a spot called Devil's Den in Newcastle. Lewis had found a place to change his bloody clothes and caught a train to Boston at 9 a.m. Upon his arrival in Boston, he used the $15 to buy new boots and a new suit. He then met up with some women he knew at a local boarding house. John, having been friends with Lewis, knew of his favorite hangout spots and told the authorities some places they might look. Sure enough, it didn't take them long to find him. Lewis went willingly when they arrested him. The next morning, Lewis was transferred from Boston to Portsmouth, and it is said upon his arrival a crowd of 10,000 were waiting, jeering, and calling for his execution. 3 days later, he was transported by train from Portsmouth Jail to Maine, where he would stand trial. The trial took place on June 9, 1873, and after 9 days of deliberation, he was found guilty of the murders. Lewis then promptly broke out of jail. He wasn't free for long, though, and he was recaptured in New Hampshire. On June 25, 1875, Lewis Wagner was led to the courtyard of the Thompson prison and hanged. The Portsmouth Athenaeum now houses the broken axe that was used to end the lives of the two young women. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button. You'll find it placed just below this video. Also consider subscribing, as it would help me to reach my goal of hitting 10 subscribers before the end of time and all that exists. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.